Somewhere in a valley between what is now Bolivia and Brazil, at least 6,000 years before anyone would ever write the word capsaicin, a wild shrub was producing small, intensely hot berries that most mammals refused to touch. That single evolutionary trait, an irritant compound that meant nothing to birds but burned like fire in the mouth of anything with molars, would eventually reshape the culinary landscape of nearly every inhabited continent on Earth. This is the story of the chili pepper, a plant whose spread across the globe traces the entire arc of early modern trade, empire, and cultural exchange. Carried not by design, but by accident, ambition, and a 500-year-old case of mistaken geography. The chili pepper belongs to the genus Capsicum, and its defining chemical feature, capsaicin, exists for a reason that has nothing to do with human enjoyment. Capsaicin binds to the same receptors in mammalian mouths that detect actual heat, which is why a bite of a hot pepper produces a genuine burning sensation even though no thermal damage is occurring. Mammals, with teeth capable of grinding and destroying a seed, evolved sensitivity to this compound, and over time, wild pepper plants that produced more capsaicin were less likely to be eaten and digested by animals that would destroy their seeds in the process. Birds, on the other hand, lack the receptor that responds to capsaicin entirely. They can eat the spiciest pepper on Earth and feel nothing at all, and because birds swallow seeds whole and pass them intact through their digestive systems, often carrying them for enormous distances in flight, they became the primary vehicle for spreading wild chili peppers across an entire continent long before any human ever cultivated one. This single evolutionary fact explains something that puzzled researchers for a long time: why archaeological, linguistic, and botanical evidence for the origin of the chili pepper each seem to point to a different location. Archaeologists working at dig sites in Ecuador have found chili pepper starch residue on ancient tools dating back roughly 6,000 years, some of the oldest direct evidence of human use of the plant anywhere in the world. Linguists tracing the earliest known words for chili point instead to Oaxaca in southern Mexico, where the term for the pepper appears in the archaeological and linguistic record around the same era. Botanists, meanwhile, argue that the genetic diversity of wild capsicum species is highest in the dense jungle regions along the border of Brazil and Bolivia, which, by the normal rules of plant genetics, usually marks the point of origin for a species. All three groups are right, because none of them are describing a single point of domestication. They are describing a wild plant that birds had already scattered across a vast swath of South and Central America long before any single human society began deliberately cultivating it, which is exactly why chili remains show up simultaneously in so many unconnected locations across such an enormous span of geography. By the time large organized civilizations rose in Mesoamerica, no society had integrated the chili pepper into daily life more completely than the Aztec and Maya. For both civilizations, chili was not a minor seasoning added at the edges of a meal. It functioned as one of the central ingredients across nearly the entire food system, appearing in savory dishes, beverages, ceremonial foods, and even medicinal preparations. Aztec medical practice frequently combined chili with corn as a treatment believed to address a wide range of common ailments, reflecting a level of everyday integration that placed the pepper somewhere between a food and a pharmaceutical. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that hundreds of distinct chili varieties were already under cultivation across the region well before European contact, each suited to different dishes, different preservation methods, and different levels of heat, indicating generations of careful, selective breeding long before anyone outside the Americas had ever tasted the plant. The chain of events that carried chili out of the Americas and onto the rest of the planet did not begin with any interest in chili at all. It began with black pepper, an entirely unrelated plant, native to the Malabar coast of southern India, and the extraordinary value Europe placed on it. Black pepper had been prized in Europe since antiquity, appearing constantly throughout Roman cookbooks as a standard seasoning for nearly every type of dish, and its value climbed high enough that, according to historical accounts, invading Visigoth forces demanded payment in black pepper as part of a ransom when they besieged Rome in the early 5th century. In the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, the pepper trade continued flowing through the Mediterranean, financing the rise of Italian trading city-states, and by the late 15th century, the ambition to control that trade directly, without relying on Arab and Venetian middlemen, is what pushed the Spanish crown to fund a westward expedition across the Atlantic in search of a new route to the source. That expedition, of course, was Columbus's. He was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for a shorter path to the pepper markets of India, and when he made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, he believed, based on the navigational understanding of his era, that he had succeeded. Assuming he had reached the outer islands of Asia, he referred to the people he encountered as Indians, an error that has persisted in language for over 5 centuries despite being wrong from the moment it was spoken. That same assumption is also the direct reason the chili pepper carries the name it does today. When Columbus encountered a local fruit that produced an intense, biting heat similar in sensation to the black pepper he had crossed an ocean to find, he assumed, reasonably enough given his belief about where he had landed, that this must be some variety of the same prized spice. He carried it back to Spain on his return voyage, and the name stuck permanently. Even though the chili pepper and black pepper are entirely unrelated plants from opposite sides of the planet, connected only by the coincidence that both produce a burning sensation on the tongue. What happened over the following decades is where the story of the chili pepper becomes genuinely global, rather than simply transatlantic. 2 European powers, Spain and Portugal, were both actively expanding into the Americas during this period, but with very different long-term strategies, and that difference in strategy is precisely what caused chili peppers to spread along 2 separate paths that would not intersect again for decades. Spain focused on territorial conquest, claiming enormous stretches of land from North America down through much of South America, and Spanish ships carried Mexican chili varieties directly back to the Iberian Peninsula. From there, those Mexican peppers began a slow overland migration eastward along established trade networks, including the Silk Road, carried by merchants who had no particular interest in the plant's origin, only in its value as a tradable good moving between one market and the next. Portugal took a fundamentally different approach, building not a territorial empire but a network of coastal trading posts stretching across multiple continents. In the same year Portuguese ships first landed in Brazil, they also established a colony in Mozambique, and within the following decades they built additional trading posts in Oman, in Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, and along much of the west coast of India. Each of these outposts functioned as a transfer point for goods moving out of the Americas. And the chili variety the Portuguese carried out of Brazil was a genetically distinct species from the one Columbus had encountered in the Caribbean and carried to Spain. This Brazilian variety followed the Portuguese trading network directly, appearing in Mozambique under one regional name, and later becoming deeply embedded in the cuisine of southern India, and eventually reaching the American South itself under yet another name entirely. 2 separate chili lineages, one moving east by land out of Spain along ancient overland trade routes, the other moving east by sea along a chain of Portuguese trading posts, were now converging on the same distant destination without either empire planning it that way, and the place where those 2 paths would eventually collide, reshaping the cuisine of an entire region into something unrecognizable from what had existed before, was the very coastline that had started this entire chain of events a century earlier, the Malabar coast of India, the original home of the black pepper that sent Columbus across the ocean in the first place. What happened when those two chili lineages met on Indian soil? How the pepper then pushed further east into China and Southeast Asia? And the strange, mostly fabricated story of what happened to chili back in Europe is where the final part of this story picks up. By the early 16th century, the Malabar coast of India had become something unusual in the history of any single crop. The meeting point of two genetically distinct chili lineages that had traveled to the same destination by completely different routes, decades apart, carried by two rival empires who had no idea they were converging on the same soil. In 1497, a Portuguese navigator charted a sea route from Europe around the southern tip of Africa and on to India, succeeding at a task Columbus had failed to accomplish just 5 years earlier. 3 years after that voyage, another Portuguese expedition set out along the same route, and on the way, that fleet made an unplanned stop that would plant the Portuguese flag in Brazil for the first time. The same fleet then continued on to India, arriving on the western coast in the final days of the year 1500, in what historical shipping records place as Christmas Eve, almost certainly the moment chili peppers first touched Asian soil, carried aboard ships that had only recently departed from Brazil. Over the following 4 decades, Portuguese trading posts expanded steadily along India's western coastline, and Portuguese ships kept arriving with cargo from Brazil, while separately, Spanish-controlled chili varieties from Mexico kept arriving by an entirely different route, carried overland by merchants working the ancient trade corridors collectively known as the Silk Road. In the kitchens of India's coastal trading cities, these two unrelated chili lineages began appearing side by side for the first time, blending into the already sophisticated spice traditions of Indian cooking. The regions where this blending happened most intensively, particularly along India's southwestern coast, remain to this day home to some of the widest diversity of chili use found anywhere on the planet, a direct legacy of that 16th century collision between two empires' separate supply chains. From India, the chili pepper's path eastward continued through established trade networks that had existed for centuries before any European ship ever carried a New World crop. In 1511, Portuguese forces under a colonial governor established a trading colony at Malacca, a critical port city on the Malay Peninsula sitting directly along the maritime routes connecting India, China, and Southeast Asia. Within a year, Portuguese trading ships were fanning out to ports across the region, carrying goods, including chili peppers, into Java, Sumatra, and the Kingdom of Siam, the historical predecessor to modern Thailand. The volume of trade flowing through these Southeast Asian ports was enormous, and much of it was handled by Chinese merchants who traveled south to fill their ships and wagons with goods before returning north by both sea and overland routes. This trading pattern is the most likely explanation for how chili peppers eventually reached China, carried not directly from Europe but indirectly through a chain of Southeast Asian intermediaries who had themselves only recently acquired the plant from Portuguese and Spanish trade networks. The exact date remains difficult to pin down, but the first confirmed written reference appears in the final decade of the 16th century, in a document from the city of Hangzhou, where the pepper was described more as a botanical curiosity than a food ingredient. That framing, as an oddity rather than a staple, reflects something important about how chili was received among China's educated and wealthy classes. The provinces where chili peppers first became genuinely embedded in everyday cooking, including Sichuan, Hunan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, were mountainous agricultural regions far removed from the wealthy centers of Beijing and Guangzhou. Among China's elite, chili was regarded as food for the poor, a way to disguise the taste of lower quality ingredients, in sharp contrast to the refined, delicate flavors favored in elite urban cuisine. Historical Chinese names for chili peppers reflected this class divide directly, with some regional terms implying the plant was fit only for farmers and laborers. It would take centuries and a genuinely transformative political shift in the mid-20th century before that perception changed at a national level, as leadership rising from precisely the rural chili-loving provinces the old elite had looked down upon, helped reframe a tolerance for spicy food as a marker of resilience and revolutionary toughness, shifting chili within a single generation from a symbol of rural poverty to a fixture of national identity. While chili peppers were working their way through China, a parallel and less well-documented spread was happening across mainland Southeast Asia. The historical record here is thinner than in China, largely because written accounts from this era were produced almost exclusively by court scribes and elite writers, not by the rural farmers and cooks who were most likely using the plant daily in their own kitchens. In the region that would become Thailand, the first confirmed written reference to chili peppers in cooking does not appear until the early 19th century, in a poem describing a dish combining chili and venison. Given how thoroughly embedded chili already was in Southeast Asian cuisine by that point, most historians consider it highly likely that rural cooks had been using the plant for a very long time before any court writer thought it worth mentioning, having most likely arrived along at least 3 separate paths simultaneously: south through the Malay Peninsula following the trade routes out of Malacca, directly through the old Siamese capital via Portuguese traders, and overland from the northwest along the Silk Road corridor bordering modern Myanmar and southern China. Back in Europe, the very continent whose ships had carried chili out of the Americas in the first place, the pepper's reception could not have followed a more different path. Spain incorporated it into a modest range of regional dishes, and in Hungary, it found a genuinely enthusiastic audience, dried, ground into powder, and exported under the name paprika as early as the second half of the 16th century. But across much of the rest of Western Europe, particularly France and Germany, chili as originally encountered in the Americas never achieved anything close to the widespread adoption seen elsewhere in the world. And this slower acceptance eventually gave rise to one of the most persistent pieces of culinary folklore ever attached to the plant. The story claims European farmers, finding New World chilies too intense for local tastes, bred a milder variety over generations that grew progressively larger and hollow, until wind blowing through the empty fruit caused an internal structure to rattle so loudly against the walls that it startled livestock during storms, giving the bell pepper its name. Once a botanist finally bred a silent version in the 20th century. The story has no historical basis whatsoever, and there's a small, almost embarrassing detail that should have tipped off anyone repeating it. The botanist supposedly credited with solving the ringing pepper problem carries a surname that is, quite literally, the name of a set of tuned bells used in a musical instrument. What actually happened is far less colorful. European breeders did, over an extended period stretching into the early 20th century, work to develop sweeter, milder pepper varieties suited to local palates, and the modern bell pepper is the eventual result of that ordinary agricultural selection, dressed up much later into a far more entertaining tale than the truth ever warranted. By the time that slow European breeding process had produced a genuinely mild pepper, the rest of the world had already moved on without waiting. Chili peppers had become fully embedded in the culinary identity of an extraordinary range of cultures, each adapting the plant to its own existing flavor traditions. Today, researchers studying chili cultivation across Asia alone have documented thousands of genetically distinct strains, and of the handful of countries producing the largest volumes of chili peppers worldwide, the majority are found across that same continent, a striking outcome for a plant that did not exist there before the final years of the 15th century. There is something worth sitting with in the full sweep of this story. A wild shrub in the jungles between Brazil and Bolivia, spread across an entire continent by birds immune to its own chemical defenses, was carried across an ocean because one navigator was looking for an entirely different plant and never realized the mistake he had made about where he had landed. That single misidentification gave the chili pepper its name, sent two rival empires carrying two distinct genetic lineages along two entirely separate trade paths, and set off a chain of contact and adaptation that would eventually reshape the cuisine of India, China, Thailand, and dozens of other cultures, each absorbing the plant so completely that it now feels indigenous rather than imported. If any part of this story surprised you, whether it's the fact that birds are the reason chilies spread across South America in the first place, the true and far less dramatic story behind the bell pepper's name, or the political history behind chili becoming a symbol of national identity in China, drop it in the comments. There's a lot more history packed into a single dried chili than most people ever stop to think about, and hearing which part of this journey stood out most to you is always worth reading.